He grabbed her wrist so hard she heard the bone pop. Not crack, pop, like something inside her had finally given up trying to hold itself together. Evelyn Mercer was 26 years old, standing in the kitchen of a man who called himself her guardian, and she understood in that single, searing moment that if she stayed one more winter under his roof, they would be burying her in the spring. Not from illness, not from accident, from the slow, deliberate erasure of everything she was. He didn't even look at her when he did it. That was the part that stayed with her longest. He was reading his newspaper, one hand turning the page, the other crushing her wrist like it was something he'd picked up off the floor. "You'll do what I tell you," he said. "You always have." If you were in her shoes, trapped, invisible, with nowhere left to run, what would you have done? Before we go further, if stories like this move you, if you believe that courage deserves to be witnessed, please subscribe to this channel and follow Evelyn's story all the way to the end. You will not want to miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming and to the moment one woman decided she would rather risk everything than survive another day as someone else's property. The advertisement had been folded so many times that the paper had gone soft along the creases, the ink slightly smeared where Evelyn's thumb had pressed it flat again and again over the course of 3 weeks. Rancher seeks capable woman for honest work and honest partnership. Wyoming territory. Room, board, and fair wages offered. References exchanged. No nonsense, no pretense, no nonsense, no pretense. She'd read those 4 words so many times they'd started to sound like a prayer. She answered the advertisement on a Tuesday in late March, writing her response with a stub of pencil at the kitchen table while Harold Vance slept off his afternoon whiskey in the parlor. She kept her handwriting small and controlled, which was a skill she'd developed the way most people develop bad habits, without noticing, until it was simply who she was. Small, controlled, taking up as little space as possible. She did not tell him she was beautiful, though she had been told she was, usually by men who used it as a reason to stand too close. She did not tell him she was educated, though she'd taught herself from the books in Harold's study, the ones he never read but kept on the shelf to impress guests. She told him she was a hard worker, that she understood livestock and gardens and the kind of silence that comes with long winters, that she was looking for a fresh start and would not be a burden. She signed it E. Mercer and mailed it before she could talk herself out of it. The reply came 17 days later. By then the bruise on her wrist had faded from purple to yellow, which was almost worse somehow. Yellow bruises always looked like they were lying about how serious they were. "Miss Mercer," the letter read, "your letter was plain spoken, and I respect that. I am not a complicated man, and this is not a complicated arrangement if you want it. I have a working ranch outside Red Willow. I need a partner, more than I need a wife, in the traditional sense of the word, though the law would call you that. You would have your own room, your own space. I don't believe in owning people. Come see if this suits you. If it doesn't, I will pay your return fare. No questions asked. Silas Boone." She read the last line 4 times. "I will pay your return fare." No questions asked. She had never in her life been offered a way out. Every arrangement she'd ever known came with locks on the doors, spoken or otherwise. She sat with that letter pressed flat against her chest for a long time, listening to Harold snore in the next room, and she made herself a promise that she has never once spoken aloud to another living soul. "I will not waste this." Getting out was the harder part. Harold Vance was not a stupid man. Cruel men rarely are. He had managed Evelyn's life with the precision of an accountant, tracking what she spent, who she spoke to, how long she was gone when she ran errands. He called it protection. He had been calling it protection since she was 15 years old and newly orphaned and desperate for any hand that reached toward her, even one with hard edges. She stole her exit in pieces over 9 days. A dress folded into her market basket under a layer of dry goods. $3 hidden in the lining of her winter coat. A tin of biscuits wrapped in cloth. The small photograph of her mother that she'd kept behind a loose board in the closet. The only thing of her own she absolutely refused to leave without. She did not say goodbye. She did not leave a note. She slipped out of that house at 4:30 in the morning while it was still full dark, wearing every layer of clothing she owned because she couldn't risk the bulk of a bag, and she walked 3 miles to the train station without once looking back. She was so afraid her hands wouldn't stop shaking for the first 2 hours on the train. The woman across the aisle, a stout grandmother type with a basket of yarn in her lap, offered her a peppermint candy and pretended not to notice. Evelyn took the candy and held it in her fist without eating it for a long time. And somehow that small, unasked-for kindness was the thing that finally made her eyes burn. She didn't cry. She'd learned not to cry years ago because crying in front of Harold always made things worse. But her eyes burned, and she allowed herself that much. By the time the train reached the outskirts of Wyoming territory, Evelyn had straightened her spine, smoothed her dress, and rebuilt the expression she wore in company: calm, agreeable, slightly pleasant, revealing nothing. She had worn that face for so long it sat on her now like a mask that had grown into the skin. She was not sure she knew what her real face looked like anymore. The station at Red Willow was small. 2 buildings, a water tower, a row of hitching posts. The afternoon light hit everything sideways in gold, and the wind came off the hills carrying the smell of dry grass and something faintly like rain that hadn't arrived yet. She stood on the platform with her one small bag at her feet and her coat buttoned to the throat despite the warmth, because the coat covered her left arm, and her left arm was something she wasn't ready to explain to a stranger. She was looking for a rancher named Silas Boone. She spotted him before he spotted her, which she was grateful for. It gave her a moment to look without being looked at, which was a luxury she rarely had. He was tall, not dramatically tall, but solid, the kind of man who took up space without trying. Dark hair, worn longer than fashion approved of, curling slightly at the collar. A working man's hands. He was holding his hat and looking at the platform with a focused, patient expression, scanning faces the way you'd look for something you expected to find rather than something you hoped for. When his eyes found her, he didn't smile right away. He just looked at her for a second, direct, unhurried, not unkind. And then he nodded once like he'd settled something in his own mind and came toward her. "Miss Mercer," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. "Mr. Boone." He put his hat back on. "How was the trip?" "Long," she said. "But fine. Train treats some people rough. I managed." He reached for her bag without making a production of it, which she appreciated more than she could have articulated. Men who made a performance of carrying things always wanted to be thanked twice. "Wagon's out front," he said. "Ride takes about 40 minutes. You hungry?" "I'm all right." He glanced at her sideways, just once. Then he said, "There's a biscuit in the wagon if you change your mind," and left it at that. The road to the Boone Ranch wound through country that was either beautiful or merciless, depending on how you felt about open spaces. And Evelyn, who had spent years in rooms with the curtains drawn, found herself holding very still and breathing through it the way you breathe through something that might be wonderful, but that you're afraid to trust yet. Silas didn't fill the silence with talk. That was the first thing she noticed about him. Most men she'd known talked constantly when they were nervous or when they wanted to keep a woman from thinking. Silas just drove, occasionally pointing out a landmark with a brief word, letting the country speak for itself. At one point, a jackrabbit shot across the road, and the horses shifted, and without thinking, Evelyn grabbed the side of the wagon with her right hand. Her right hand, not her left. And Silas steadied the team and then glanced at her, just briefly. "Spooked?" he asked. "A little," she admitted, which surprised her. She didn't usually admit to being anything. "Me too. First time I drove this road alone," he said. "Took me 2 years to stop flinching." She looked at him. He was watching the horses. "You've been here 2 years?" she asked. 6. Flinched for the first 2. She almost smiled. She caught it, though, and smoothed it back into neutral before it could be seen. Old habit. The ranch appeared over a rise just before sunset. A main house, a barn, 2 smaller outbuildings, a stretch of fence line that disappeared into the hills. It was not picturesque. The barn needed painting. One of the fence posts leaned at an angle that suggested it had been meaning to fall over for some time and hadn't quite committed. There was a kitchen garden to the side of the house that had gone mostly to weeds, though she could still make out where someone had planted rows once, long ago. "It's a working ranch," Silas said, as though he'd read her assessment. "Not a showplace." "I didn't come for a showplace," she said. He looked at her again. That same direct, unhurried look. "No," he said after a moment. "I didn't think you did." He showed her the house without ceremony, The front room, the kitchen, a narrow hallway, and then a door at the end of it. "This is your room," he said, pushing it open. "Lock works from the inside, keys on the hook there. I'd ask you to keep it, not because I think you need to, but because I want you to know the option exists." She stood in the doorway and looked at the room. A bed with a quilt, a window with a view of the hills, a small table and a chair, a hook on the door. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out strange, slightly compressed, like she was pushing it through a smaller space than it needed. He handed her the key. His fingers didn't brush hers. He was careful about that, she noticed, deliberate, like a man who had thought about what not to do. "Supper's in an hour if you're up for it," he said. "If you're not, there's no offense taken." He left her in the doorway and went back down the hall, and she heard the quiet sounds of the kitchen beginning. A pot moved, the creak of the stove door, a quiet word to himself that she couldn't make out. She closed her door. She turned the key in the lock. She put her back against the door and slid down it until she was sitting on the floor with her knees pulled up and the key pressed between both palms. And she stayed there for a long time in the warm, early evening quiet, listening to the sounds of a house that no one was going to hurt her in. She wasn't sure of that last part. She wasn't sure of anything yet. But the key was heavy in her hands, and the lock held, and nobody came. She made it to supper, sat across from him at a square kitchen table that had seen better decades, and ate beans and cornbread and said very little, and he said very little back, and the silence between them was nothing like the silence she'd lived in with Harold, which had always been a held breath, a pressure system, something waiting to break badly. This silence just sat there, ordinary, unbothered. "Hands start at sunup," Silas said at one point, meaning the ranch workers. "You'll meet them in the morning. Good men, mostly. Tom Briggs talks a great deal. Doesn't mean harm by it." "I've dealt with talkers," she said. "I believe that." She helped clear the plates without asking if she should. He washed, she dried, and they stood at the same basin in the same kitchen, and it was the most normal thing she had done in years, and it made her feel like something inside her chest was cracking open along a fault line she hadn't known was there. She went to bed with the key under her pillow. She did not sleep for a long time. In the morning, she came to breakfast with her left sleeve buttoned to the wrist. It was warm enough that she should have had her sleeves rolled. She knew that. But the bruises from Harold's last morning, the morning she'd left, were still a faded map of everything she was running from, and she wasn't ready. She made the coffee while Silas was outside checking on the horses. She made it strong, the way she'd had to learn to make it for Harold or face a bad morning, and when Silas came in and poured himself a cup and took one sip, he said, "That's the best coffee I've had in 6 years." "I've had practice," she said. She didn't say at what. He didn't ask. It was the ranch hand Tom Briggs who noticed first, not the bruises, but the flinch. They were out by the fence line, and Tom made a sudden gesture with a hammer, nothing aimed at anyone, just emphasizing a point he was making about a loose post, and Evelyn stepped back fast and sharp, the way you step back from something that's been thrown at you before you know it isn't being thrown. Tom blinked, went quiet mid-sentence. She recovered immediately, smoothed her expression, adjusted her sleeve, made a small remark about the post that redirected the conversation. Years of practice. She was very good at this. But Silas had been watching from 6 feet away, and Silas was not Tom Briggs. He didn't say anything in that moment. He just went back to work. But she caught the change in him, something that went careful and quiet in a different way than before, like a man recalibrating. That evening, she was bringing water from the pump when the handle slipped and the full bucket swung and caught her left arm hard. And the sound that came out of her was not the sound of someone startled. It was smaller than that, more controlled. The sound of someone who had learned to swallow pain before it reached their face. She looked up. Silas was standing at the barn door. He'd heard it. Their eyes met across 20 feet of yard in the last light of the afternoon. He came toward her slowly. Not fast. Not the way a man comes when he's decided something. The way a person approaches a bird that might take flight. He stopped a few feet short of her, looked at her arm, looked at her face. "You want some help with that bucket?" he asked. His voice was level. Careful. Like he was offering the words and the question behind the question at the same time, and she could take whichever one she was ready for. She handed him the bucket. Their hands both held the handle for 1 second. And then he looked at her. Not at her arm, not at the way she was holding herself, but at her face, where the thing she was carrying had slipped, just for a moment, and could be seen. "Who hurt you?" he asked. Quiet. Not aggressive, not pitying, just the words. Like he was asking because he thought she deserved to have someone ask. She didn't answer. She took the bucket back and carried it to the house herself, spilling a little, and he let her go without another word. But that night, after supper, she sat in her room with the key under her hand and thought about those 3 words. Who hurt you? And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel like a woman swallowing herself whole. She felt, distantly, impossibly, like someone who might one day be allowed to answer honestly. Not yet, but maybe. The crack in the fault line spread a little further, and she held it together with both hands and wept without making a sound, which was the only way she knew how. Part 2. Louis. Viết Munchausen, Fan 100. To liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liên mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liên mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sảng. Có yếu tố con người, cả miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo. Kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau, tóm câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Dan bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật, không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng, nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dụng giữa câu hay viết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh không mở rộng nội dung. Show more. The morning after. Silas asked her that question. Evelyn woke before dawn and lay still for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ranch breathe itself awake, the creak of the barn, the low complaint of cattle somewhere past the fence line, the wind working its way under the eaves with a sound like something trying to find a way in. She told herself it meant nothing, that he'd asked the way a person asks about a sprained ankle, practical concern, nothing more. She told herself she'd handled it correctly by not answering, and that today would be the same as yesterday, and that the best thing she could do was be useful and quiet and give him no reason to regret the arrangement. She believed maybe half of that. She was in the kitchen with the stove lit and the coffee on before the sky had gone fully light. And when Silas came in, he stopped at the doorway for just a moment. Not long enough to make something of it, but long enough for her to notice that he noticed she was already there. "You didn't have to do that," he said, meaning the coffee and the biscuits she'd found flour for and mixed and had in the pan. "I was awake," she said. He pulled out his chair and sat down and didn't press it. She brought 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat across the table. And they drank in silence that was easier than it had any right to be, given what had passed between them the evening before. He didn't bring it up. She was grateful for that in a way that sat heavy and complicated in her chest, because she wasn't sure if his silence meant he'd decided to let it go, or if he was simply patient in a way she didn't have a category for yet. Tom Briggs arrived at 6:15 with his hat crooked and a story already half-formed on his lips about something that had happened with his neighbor's mule, and the particular energy of the morning shifted into the ordinary business of a working ranch, and Evelyn let herself be carried along by it. She found her footing in work the way she always had. Work was honest. Work asked clear questions and gave clear answers. By the end of the first week at Boone Ranch, she had assessed the kitchen garden, which was genuinely a wreck, tangled with volunteer weeds and last year's dead growth still standing because no one had pulled it, and begun the slow work of reclaiming it. Not because anyone had asked, because her hands needed something to do, and because plants, unlike people, did not have complicated motives. Silas found her out there on a Saturday afternoon with her sleeves still rolled down despite the heat, pulling dead matter from the bed that had once been herbs. "My wife planted those," he said. He hadn't made a sound walking up, and she didn't flinch. She'd heard his footsteps by then, had already learned the particular weight of how he moved, which was something she did automatically with people now, cataloging them by sound, so she always knew where they were. She passed 3 years ago. Fever. I'm sorry, Evelyn said. So am I. He crouched down across the bed from her and picked up a handful of dead stems and turned them over in his hands. She would have wanted it kept up. I just didn't have the heart for it. Evelyn didn't say anything immediately. She worked the roots of a stubborn weed loose and turned the soil back and patted it down. What did she grow? She asked. Sage. Lavender. Some kind of mint she swore came from her grandmother's garden in Ohio. He let the dead stems fall. I never could tell the mint from the weeds. The mint will still be there, Evelyn said. Under all this. Mint doesn't give up easily. He looked at her. Not at the garden. At her. The kind of look that wasn't trying to see through her exactly, but wasn't looking away from what was on the surface either. No, he said after a moment. I suppose it doesn't. She went back to her weeding and he went back to whatever he'd been doing before, and nothing more was said. But that evening at supper, the quality of the silence between them had shifted again. Warmer, somehow, and more weighted, like a room after the fire's been burning long enough to push the chill back from the walls. She told him about the garden plan over supper that night, what she thought needed pulling versus what could be saved, where the soil was compacted and needed turning. He listened without interrupting, which was something she kept having to adjust to. Men who listened completely instead of waiting for their turn to correct her. Do whatever you think is right, he said when she finished. It's yours to work with. She looked at her plate. It's your garden. It'll be your garden if you keep putting that kind of effort into it, he said, and his tone was easy, like he was saying something obvious, and she felt that fault line in her chest shift again, just slightly. Tom Briggs thinks I'm strange, she said, changing the subject with the abruptness of someone who's been in the middle of a feeling they don't trust. Tom Briggs thinks his mule understands English, Silas said. His opinion is not the most reliable instrument. She laughed. It came out before she could stop it, short, surprised, almost rusty from disuse, like a door being opened that hadn't been opened in a long time. Silas didn't make a big thing of it. He just smiled at his coffee cup, briefly, and let it pass. But she noticed. And she thought he probably noticed that she noticed. And for a while after that, there was just the quiet sound of the ranch settling around them, and it was not peaceful, exactly. She didn't trust peaceful yet, but it was the closest thing she'd felt to it in a decade. The ranch hands accepted her with varying degrees of suspicion and warmth over the following weeks. Tom Briggs, as predicted, talked at her constantly and meant no harm. A younger man named Cal, who was about 20 and seemed to be perpetually sunburned, watched her with a kind of wary respect, like she was a tool he'd been handed without the instructions. An older hand named Pete, who had a gray beard and the slow movements of a man who had done everything that needed doing on a ranch and was now simply doing it again, said very little, but nodded at her each morning with the genuine warmth of someone who appreciated people who worked without making a production of it. She worked. She worked hard enough that her hands, which had been soft from years of house service, began to roughen, and her shoulders found a different kind of muscle memory than they'd had before. Not the braced tension of waiting for something to go wrong, but the honest fatigue of effort given freely. She still kept her sleeves down. She was aware that people noticed, in the particular way that people in small communities notice things they're too polite to ask about. The bruises had long since faded, but the habit of covering them was so old now it felt like something structural, like taking it off would mean something she wasn't prepared to commit to. It was Pete who said something first, and even then not to her directly. She was coming around the corner of the barn one morning when she heard him and Tom Briggs on the other side of the wall, voices low. Something happened to that woman before she came here, Pete was saying. That's all I'm saying. She seems fine to me, Tom said. She is fine, Pete said. That's not the same as nothing happened. Evelyn stood very still on her side of the wall for a moment. Then she walked back the way she'd come and went the long way around to the water pump and stood there with her hands on the handle, breathing. She was not angry. That surprised her. She'd expected to feel exposed, caught, reduced to something pitiable. Instead, she felt almost seen, which was different, terrifyingly different. She was still standing there when Silas came around the corner of the house. Pete said you were looking for the... He stopped. looked at her. You all right? Fine, she said automatically. He didn't accept that. Not rudely. He didn't push or pry. He just didn't walk away from it the way most people would have. You heard something you weren't meant to, he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him sharply. Pete's not one for gossip, Silas said. Whatever he said, he meant it with respect. That's just how he is. He paused. Are you actually fine? Or are you just fine? She understood the difference he was making. The question landed somewhere under her sternum and sat there. I'm managing, she said, which was closer to the truth than fine. He nodded. All right. He turned to go, then stopped. For what it's worth, and you can take this for whatever it's worth, those men in there respect you. They don't talk about things because they enjoy it. They talk because they care about who's around them. He glanced at her once more. You can hate that if you want. It's understandable, but it's true. He went back around the corner and left her at the water pump, and she stood there long enough that her shadow moved while she wasn't watching it. She did not hate it. That was the problem. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in early June, 4 weeks and 3 days after she'd arrived at the ranch. She had been counting, the way a person counts when they're still not sure the good thing is real. It came with the general mail delivery, tucked between a supply invoice and a seed catalog, and the name on the outside was in a handwriting she would have known blindfolded, in the dark, at the bottom of a well. She had spent years organizing Harold Vance's correspondence. She knew his hand the way you know the smell of something that made you sick. Miss Mercer. Or should I say Mrs. Boone? How very resourceful you've become. She read it standing in the front room, still holding the seed catalog in her other hand. And by the second line, she was no longer seeing the words. She was seeing his face, that particular expression he wore when he was explaining to her exactly how little control she had over her own life, patient and almost kindly, like a man describing the weather to someone too foolish to look out the window. You belong to me. Not in the way you're imagining when you read that. Not that I wouldn't have every legal right to argue the financial arrangements you abandoned without settlement, the debts that remain in your name, the years of housing and provision that you accepted and then simply walked away from in the night like a thief. But we both know it's more than that. You are what I made you. Do you honestly believe a rough cattle rancher and a few months of Wyoming air will change that? Come home, Evelyn, or I will come to you, and I assure you that will be far less pleasant for everyone involved. H.V. She folded the letter along its original creases. Her hands were steady. She was proud of her hands for being steady, the way you're proud of a part of yourself that performs under pressure even when the rest of you is quietly coming apart. She put the letter in her apron pocket and went outside and weeded the entire herb garden for an hour without stopping, pulling things up by the root with a thoroughness that had nothing to do with gardening. And when Silas called her for supper, she went inside and sat down and ate and answered his questions with correct and normal-sounding words and gave nothing away. She was very good at this. She had been very good at this for a long time. The second letter came 9 days later. This one was addressed to Silas. She didn't know what was in it. She didn't ask. But she saw Silas read it at the kitchen table after supper, and she watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do before. A stillness that was different from his usual stillness, harder underneath. His jaw set. His eyes moved slowly across the page, the way eyes move when you're reading something a second time to make sure you understood it correctly the first time. He folded it and set it on the table in front of him and looked at it for a moment. A man named Harold Vance, he said. He didn't phrase it as a question. The name in Silas's voice, in this kitchen, in this house she had begun, carefully and partially, to think of as something like safe. It landed like a hand on the back of her neck. Yes, she said. He says you left owing him a considerable sum of money. That is not true, she said. Her voice was level. He provided housing and meals in exchange for housekeeping, cooking, management of his household accounts, and a significant amount of other labor. If any accounting is owed, it is owed to me. Silas looked at her. He also says you're not well, Silas said. Mentally. He uses the word unstable. His tone when he said the word made it clear he had already decided how much weight to give it. She felt something cold move through her. Of course he did. Of course that was the play. Unstable. It was the word men like Harold reached for when they wanted to preemptively discredit whatever a woman might say in her own defense. She had watched him use it on other people. She had always known, somewhere under the daily mechanics of surviving him, that one day he would use it on her. "Do you believe that?" she asked. Silas picked up the letter and held it briefly, then set it back down. "I've watched you run a household schedule, manage a garden, earn the respect of men who are not easy to impress, and make coffee that is genuinely the best I've had in my adult life," he said. "Does that answer your question?" She breathed, slowly. "He'll write to others," she said, "to people in town. He does this. He builds a picture of a person, and then he shows it to everyone. And by the time you try to say the picture is wrong, everyone's already seen it and already half decided. Then we make sure the people who matter here know the real picture first," Silas said. It came out simple, like it was a practical problem and not a terror she'd lived inside for years. "It's not that easy." "No," he said. "It's not. But it's what we do." He paused. "If you'll let me." That last part. "If you'll let me." She sat with it. She had not been asked permission for anything in so long that the question felt almost foreign in structure, like a word she knew the meaning of but hadn't heard spoken in years. "He's going to make it ugly," she said. "For you, for the ranch. He has contacts, and he's not above lying to people who have the ability to cause you real problems." "I'm aware men like that exist," Silas said. He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking you to protect me from it. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you while it happens." The silence that followed that was a different kind of silence from any they'd shared before. It had weight to it. Not pressure. Weight. The kind that comes with something real. She looked at the table, at the letter lying between them on the worn wood. "He's not wrong that I owe him nothing legally provable," she said quietly. "The arrangement was verbal. I have no papers. He made sure of that." She paused. "He's very careful about what he puts in writing and what he doesn't." "Then he sent me something he didn't intend to," Silas said, and tapped the folded letter once. "Because this is in writing." She looked up. Silas was not angry the way Harold was angry, hot and searching for an outlet. He was the other kind. The kind that compresses. She recognized it as genuinely more dangerous, and for a moment she was almost sorry for Harold Vance, which was an absurd thing to feel, and she knew it. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Reply," he said, politely. "And then speak to someone in town about what our legal options look like, should this become more than letters." She nodded slowly, turned her cup in her hands. "Evelyn." He said her given name. He'd used it rarely, and each time it arrived slightly differently, not intrusively, but like something intended to land precisely. "Whatever he said about you, to me, to people in town, to anyone, you get to decide what's true about yourself, not him." She wanted to believe that. She was not quite able to believe that yet, but she was less far from believing it than she had been 4 weeks ago, and that had to count for something. She went to town with Silas 3 days later for supplies, and she felt it before she could confirm it. The particular quality of attention that means people have been talking. Not everyone, but enough. Mrs. Calloway at the dry goods store was pleasant with Silas and slightly careful with Evelyn, in a way that was noticeable precisely because it was trying not to be. 2 women across the street watched and then looked away when Evelyn's eyes found them. Harold's letters had arrived. She kept her chin level and her expression neutral and helped load the wagon with the calm efficiency she had perfected over years. And she did not let anyone see her hands tighten on the flour sack handles or the small controlled way she breathed through the moment in the hardware store when a man she'd never met looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has been told something unflattering about a stranger and has chosen to believe it. In the wagon on the way back, she was quiet for a long time. "It started," she said finally. "I know," Silas said. "Mrs. Calloway used to say hello to me first," Evelyn said. "Now she says hello to you and then to me." He didn't pretend he hadn't noticed. "Yes." "How bad do you think it'll get?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that means someone is deciding how honest to be. She appreciated that he was thinking about it rather than reassuring her reflexively. "Depends on how long he's willing to keep it up," Silas said. "Men like that either lose interest when they don't get a reaction or they escalate." "He escalates," she said. No hesitation. "Then it'll get worse before it gets better," he said. "But it will get better. People in Red Willow are not stupid. They'll see it for what it is over time. She looked at the hills going by. The sky was enormous out here, which she still hadn't fully adjusted to. In her old life, the sky had mostly been something seen through windows. Out here, it just kept going. What if they don't? She asked. Then we live well anyway, he said, and we let that speak for itself. She looked at him. The side of his face, his eyes on the road ahead, the particular set of his jaw that she had learned meant he had made a decision and was not particularly interested in unmade it. She looked back at the road. The mint had come in since she'd cleared the bed. Just starting. Small pale shoots, tentative but definite, pushing up through the turned soil. She'd noticed it that morning and stood over it for a moment before she'd gone in for breakfast. Harold Vance's third letter, when it came, was addressed not to Silas or to Evelyn but to the sheriff of Red Willow County. She found out from Tom Briggs, who had heard it from his cousin who worked at the post office, which was a chain of information that would have been laughable if its content hadn't been so precisely what she'd been afraid of. Harold had written to Sheriff Beaumont claiming that Evelyn had left his care in a state of mental distress, that she was vulnerable and easily deceived, and that he was concerned she had been taken advantage of by an unscrupulous man seeking cheap labor and cheaper domestic arrangements. The word unscrupulous, when applied to Silas Boone, made something in her go white hot in a way that surprised her with its intensity. She had not expected to feel angry on his behalf. She was still learning, daily, that she was allowed to feel angry at all. "He's going after your reputation," she said to Silas that evening. She'd been sitting on it since Tom told her, letting it clarify into something she could say clearly. "Not just mine. He's going after yours with the sheriff because he knows that if the sheriff starts looking at you sideways, it affects everything. The cattle contracts, the water rights dispute Cal mentioned, all of it." Silas was quiet. "He did his research," she said. "He knows what hurts you. That's what he does. He finds the thing that matters to you, and he uses it." "How do you know what he researched?" "Because that's how he kept me," she said. She said it flat and plain, the way you say something you've never said before but have thought 1,000 times. "He always knew what mattered to me. He knew about the photograph of my mother before I knew he knew. He knew I'd borrowed a book from a neighbor woman without asking. He knew everything I cared about, and he held it over me, and I never understood how until I was deep enough in to understand that the knowing was the point." She paused. "He will have found out about the water rights, the contracts, whatever he thinks you'll fight hardest to protect. He'll threaten that." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "You're not scared right now," he said. "You're furious." She blinked. Then she realized he was right. The shaking that had lived in her hand since that first letter had gone, and in its place was something that had a harder edge to it, something she barely recognized because it had been gone so long. "Yes," she said. "Good," Silas said. And the way he said it, not triumphant, not manipulative, just plain and honest and like he meant it completely, opened something else in that fault line she kept carrying around in her chest. "I want to fight him," she said, and her own voice surprised her. "I don't want to hide and wait and hope he gets bored. I want to stop surviving this quietly." "Then we don't," Silas said. "We stop being quiet." She looked at her hands, spread on the table in front of her. The roughened palms, the faded places where the bruises had been. "I don't know how to do that," she said honestly. "I've never done that." "I know," he said. "We figure it out together." He said together the same easy way he'd said, "if you'll let me." Like it was simple, like it didn't cost him anything, like standing beside a woman that a vindictive man was actively trying to destroy was just a thing you did because it was right. She wasn't used to people who did things simply because they were right. She was starting to be. Outside, the wind moved through the repaired section of fence that Cal had finally gotten around to straightening, and the mint in the herb garden pushed another half-inch toward the light, stubborn and unhurried, growing in its own time whether the conditions were perfect or not. Inside, Evelyn Mercer sat across from a man who had asked her permission before standing beside her, and she made a decision, quietly and without ceremony, that she was going to tell him the truth. Not all of it, not tonight, but more than she had ever told anyone. She took a breath. "His name was Harold Vance," she said, "and it started when I was 15. Silas didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just looked at her with those direct, unhurried eyes and waited, the way a person waits when they understand that what's being handed to them is fragile and that how you receive it matters as much as the receiving. And Evelyn, for the first time in 11 years, began to speak. She talked for almost 2 hours. She had not planned to go that long. She had planned to give him the outline, enough to understand the situation, enough to explain Harold Vance in strategic terms so they could figure out how to fight him. That was all she had intended. But somewhere in the telling, the outline became the actual shape of the thing, and the actual shape turned out to be bigger and older and more complicated than a strategy session could contain. She told him about the photograph of her mother that Harold had moved without telling her, so that she'd spent a terrified afternoon convinced she'd lost it, only to have him produce it that evening with the patience of a man doing a kindness. She told him about the debts he'd recorded in a ledger she'd never been permitted to see, debts that supposedly accumulated against the cost of her room and board, debts that he referenced whenever she asked about leaving as though the numbers in that ledger were a wall she could not walk through. She told him about the women who had tried to befriend her over the years, and how each one had eventually fallen away, not dramatically, not through any single incident she could point to, but through the slow accumulation of Harold's comments. "She's not quite reliable, that one. I'd be careful. She tends to invite trouble." Until Evelyn found herself socially marooned in a way that looked, from the outside, like her own preference for solitude. She told him about the wrist. She told him about the morning she left. She didn't cry. She was past the crying stage of this particular story. She'd cried it out alone, in the dark, in rooms where no one could hear her, over the course of years. What she had now was just the facts, stripped down and plain spoken, and she laid them out on Silas Boone's kitchen table like evidence, which is exactly what they were. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. The stove had burned down to low, and the room had gotten cooler, and at some point during the telling, Silas had gotten up and put more wood in without interrupting her, which she appreciated with a specificity she couldn't entirely explain. He was quiet for a long moment after she stopped talking. Not the silence of a man who didn't know what to say. The silence of a man making sure he had the right thing before he opened his mouth. "He kept the ledger," Silas said finally. "The debt ledger. Do you think he still has it?" She blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say. "Yes," she said slowly. "He keeps everything, every document, every letter, every record. He believes in paper." "That might be his problem," Silas said. "A man who believes in paper leaves a record of how he operates." She looked at him. He was not angry on her behalf in the way she had steeled herself for. The hot, chest-forward anger that men sometimes produced when hearing about another man's cruelty. The kind that was really about the teller rather than the listener. He was thinking, practically, like someone dismantling a structure by looking for which pieces were load-bearing. "You're not—" She stopped. "What?" "I expected you to—" She tried again. Most people, when they hear it, they want to say something about what kind of man he is. They want to react. "I know what kind of man he is," Silas said simply. "What I want to know is how to stop him." She sat with that for a moment. Then she nodded once, and something in her posture, something she'd been holding since the first letter arrived, eased a fraction of an inch. They talked for another hour after that, practical talk. Silas wanted to visit a lawyer named Aldridge in Red Willow who handled land disputes and had, as Silas put it, a thorough dislike of people who use paperwork as a weapon. He wanted to write to the county where Harold Vance lived and request any public records related to his financial dealings. He wanted to speak with Sheriff Beaumont directly before Harold's narrative had more time to calcify. "He'll already have talked to Beaumont," Evelyn said. "Probably," Silas said. "But Beaumont's known me for 6 years. He doesn't love me, but he respects the ranch. That counts for something." "Harold will find the thing that makes Beaumont doubt you," she said. The warning came out automatically. Years of watching Harold work. And then she stopped herself because she realized she was doing the thing she'd always done, which was to manage the danger quietly and alone, to minimize and contain and handle it herself before anyone else had to. "I know," Silas said. He looked at her steadily. "And when he does, we handle that too. One problem at a time." She went to bed that night with her mind running too fast to sleep, but for different reasons than it had run fast before. Before, it had run from fear, the constant low-grade scanning of a person who has learned to anticipate threats. Now it ran from something closer to purpose. It was a different quality of alertness. It was almost useful. The visit to Sheriff Beaumont happened on a Friday morning, and it did not go as well as Silas had hoped or as badly as Evelyn had feared, which put it squarely in the category of things that simply needed to be survived. Beaumont was a compact man in his 50s with a gray mustache and the particular wariness of someone who had seen enough people claim innocence to have made a general policy of believing no one completely. He sat behind a desk with Harold's letter in front of him, not hiding it, not producing it dramatically, just having it there. And he listened to Silas with the expression of a man processing something he hadn't fully decided about yet. When Silas finished speaking, Beaumont looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Boone," he said, and the name still arrived strangely each time someone used it. "This man claims you left his household under circumstances that were, let me find the word he used, distressing to him." "I imagine they were," Evelyn said. "He lost an unpaid housekeeper." Beaumont's mustache moved slightly, not quite a smile. "He also claims there are financial matters unresolved." "There are no legitimate financial claims against me," Evelyn said. She had rehearsed this, not the words exactly, but the steadiness. "I worked in his household for 11 years beginning at the age of 15 following my parents' deaths. The housing and food I received was compensation for that work, not charity. Any ledger he has produced to the contrary is his own creation." "You can prove that?" "He can't prove otherwise," Silas said. "The arrangement was verbal, which means the only written record is the one he made himself. That's not a legal document. That's a man writing down whatever number he chose." Beaumont looked between them. He tapped the letter once. "He wrote to me asking that I make inquiries into your household, Mr. Boone, specifically regarding the circumstances under which Mrs. Boone came to be here and the nature of the arrangement." "The nature of the arrangement is that she's my wife," Silas said, "which is a legal fact, and she came here because she answered an advertisement and chose to, which is her right." "He suggests her capacity to make that choice was compromised," Evelyn said flatly. "Yes, he would." She looked at Beaumont directly. She had decided, coming in, that the worst thing she could do was look like a woman who was afraid of being looked at. "Sheriff, I'm going to say something plainly, and I'd like you to hear it plainly. Harold Vance will tell anyone willing to listen that I am not of sound mind, because that is the most effective way to discredit anything I might say about him. It is a strategy, not an assessment. If you want to form your own opinion about my soundness, I'd suggest looking at what I've done since I arrived here, the work, the household, the people I've dealt with, rather than the claims of the man I was running from." Beaumont looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Silas. "Tom Briggs says she's the best thing that's happened to your garden in 3 years, Beaumont said. "Tom Briggs is not wrong," Silas said. Beaumont folded Harold's letter and slid it to the side of his desk. Not away, but to the side. "I'm not going to open an inquiry on the basis of what's in here," he said. "Not enough to go on. But I'll tell you both straight. If this man files anything formal, through a lawyer or through the county courts where he lives, I'll have to take it more seriously. So if there's anything you need to put in order, I'd do it while you have the time." It was not a victory, but it was not a defeat either. Walking out of the sheriff's office into the hard noon sunlight, Evelyn felt the specific sensation of a battle survived rather than won, and she was learning to tell the difference. They stopped at the lawyer Aldridge's office on the way out of town. He was a thin man with wire glasses and ink-stained fingers who listened to the situation with the focused patience of someone who had heard most varieties of human dispute and developed strong opinions about which ones were worth his time. He decided this one was worth his time about halfway through Silas's account, and Evelyn watched him sit forward slightly in his chair, the way a man sits forward when he smells something he recognizes. "The letters to the sheriff are actually useful to you," Aldridge said when they'd finished. "Any legal action he takes will be subject to those letters as context. They establish a pattern of behavior, harassment, reputational interference. We document everything going forward, every letter, every date, every communication." He looked at Evelyn. "Has he made any direct contact with you since you left?" "The first letter," she said. "The one addressed to me." "Keep it." He paused. "Did he ever put anything in writing about the financial arrangement while you were in his household?" "Not that I saw. He was careful about that." Men who are careful about what they put in writing Aldridge said, are usually not careful about what they say out loud. Is there anyone from that time who might speak to what they witnessed? Neighbors? A physician? Anyone who interacted with you regularly? She thought. The neighbor women who'd drifted away. The shopkeeper who'd sometimes seen her bruises and said nothing, not out of cruelty, but out of that particular cowardice that masquerades as minding your own business. And then, at the edges of the memory, someone she hadn't thought of in years. There was a doctor, she said slowly. An older man, Dr. Harlan. He treated me twice for injuries that Harold told him were accidents. She stopped, remembered the look the old doctor had given her the second time, over Harold's shoulder. A long, quiet look that said everything he couldn't say in front of the man standing behind her. I think he knew. I think he suspected, at least. Aldridge's pen moved. Full name? I don't know his first name. Dr. Harlan. He practiced out of Calverton. He'd be in his 70s now if he's still practicing. We'll find him, Aldridge said. Walking back to the wagon, Evelyn was quiet for a block before she said, if Harlan is found and agrees to speak, Harold will know we're building something. He'll escalate. I know, Silas said. I mean, he'll actually escalate, not just letters. When his plans don't work, he doesn't accept it and adjust. He breaks things. Silas glanced at her. What does he break? She pulled on the wagon rail and climbed up, settled herself. Looked at the street ahead of them, ordinary Friday afternoon in Red Willow, people going about things. Whatever matters most to the person he's angry at, she said. The summer heat settled into the valley in the weeks that followed with the dull insistence of a guest who hasn't understood they're not welcome. Work on the ranch continued. It had to. It always did. And Evelyn found a strange comfort in the way the livestock and the garden and the daily rhythm of the place were entirely indifferent to Harold Vance and his letters. The horses did not care. The mint kept growing. Cal got his sunburn refreshed every week like clockwork. Aldridge sent 2 letters and received 1 reply, which contained language he described in his follow-up note to Silas as legally aggressive and personally revealing. Harold Vance had hired his own lawyer. The fight, which had been a cold war of correspondence, was warming. She noticed the change in town before Silas said anything about it. She had the advantage of watching for it, of having spent years learning to read rooms and people and the subtle meteorology of social disapproval. Mrs. Calloway's careful politeness had not warmed. The 2 women who had looked away still looked away, though one of them had progressed to a small, stiff nod, which Evelyn decided to count as something. But there were others. Pete's wife, a broad and plain-spoken woman named Ruth, who ran the dry goods account for 3 ranches in the valley, had taken to greeting Evelyn directly, and with the specific warmth of a woman who has made a deliberate decision about which side of something she's on. The postmistress, who saw every letter that came and went, had started saving the seed catalogs separately, so Evelyn wouldn't have to dig for them. Small things, the kind of things that don't show up anywhere except in the daily texture of being somewhere, and that matter enormously if you've spent years in a place where no small thing went your way. It was Tom Briggs who told her about the rumor, because Tom Briggs told everyone everything and could not be faulted for it because he was constitutionally incapable of information containment. Heard something in town, he said, appearing at her elbow while she was tying back the climbing bean rows, with the opening line of a man who has been holding something in for longer than is comfortable. Might be nothing, probably nothing, but... Tell me, Tom. There's talk that a man came through Red Willow last week, asking questions about the ranch, about Silas, about you. He turned his hat in his hands. Didn't give his name, but somebody said he had the look of a man who'd been sent rather than a man who'd come on his own. She kept her hands on the bean row. What kind of questions? About the water rights. Whether the ranch was solid financially, whether Silas had any trouble with anyone in the county. Tom paused. And about you specifically, whether anyone here thought you seemed right in the head. She straightened up, looked at the garden, not at Tom. Who did he talk to? Couple of people at the saloon. Marcus Webb. You know Marcus, the one who sells lumber. Never liked Silas much on account of some business thing I never understood. And Tom hesitated. And he talked to Deputy Crane for about half an hour. Deputy Crane was not Beaumont. Beaumont was a man who made his decisions slowly and kept them when made. Crane was younger and more susceptible to the kind of narrative that arrived well-dressed and well-spoken with a letter of introduction. "Thank you, Tom," she said. "I probably shouldn't have said." "You absolutely should have," she said, "and I mean that." She went to find Silas. "I was in the barn with Cal, working on a section of the roof where a board had warped and let in weather. She came in out of the afternoon heat and waited, and he looked down from where he was balanced on a crossbeam, read her face in the way he'd become accurate at, and said to Cal, 'Take a break,' with a brevity that Cal didn't question. She told him what Tom had said. He listened from where he was, one hand on the crossbeam, not moving. When she finished, he came down from the beam, not hurrying, just moving through the task of climbing down with the deliberateness of a man managing his own response. "He's looking for something to use in court," Silas said. "The water rights issue is 3 years old and already settled. If he's asking about that, he doesn't know it's settled, which means his information is secondhand." "His man talked to Deputy Crane," Evelyn said. "I'll talk to Beaumont." "Silas." She said his name the way he sometimes said hers, landing it precisely. "This is going to keep escalating. I need you to understand. I need you to genuinely understand that he does not stop. He has never stopped when something didn't work. He just changes his method." Silas looked at her. "I understand that." "Do you?" She wasn't challenging him. She was asking. "Because the people I've watched him go after, they always thought at some point he'd—" She searched for the word. "They thought there was a level where it becomes not worth his time. There isn't. He goes until he wins or until something stops him, not discourages him, stops him." The barn was quiet around them, the particular dusty quiet of old wood and hay and the faint sounds of horses shifting in their stalls. "Then we stop him," Silas said. "How?" "By not hiding. By making sure everyone who can be shown the truth gets shown it. By building the kind of record that a court can read and understand." He paused. "And by not flinching." "I've been not flinching my whole life," she said with an edge she hadn't intended. "No," he said quietly. "You've been surviving quietly. Those aren't the same thing. Surviving quietly means he still controls what you're allowed to say and where you're allowed to say it. Not flinching means you say it anyway." He held her gaze. "There's a difference between endurance and refusal. You've had plenty of endurance. I'm asking you to start working on the refusal." She stood in the dusty barn heat with that landing somewhere deep in her chest and not entirely comfortable there because he was right. And being right about something she hadn't been able to name herself was a specific kind of discomfort. "I'm working on it," she said finally. "I know," he said. "You're better at it than you think." The storm came in 3 weeks later, on a Thursday night in late July, when the heat had been building for 5 days straight, and the sky had the yellowish pressed-down quality that meant something was about to break. It came in fast from the northwest the way Wyoming storms do. Not gradually, but all at once, like a decision. Lightning first, then thunder close behind, then rain that arrived not as rain but as a wall, hitting the roof of the house with the flat, sudden weight of something thrown. Evelyn was awake when it started. She'd been awake for an hour already, lying in the dark with the kind of sleeplessness that comes from the body knowing something the mind hasn't admitted to yet. She was thinking about Aldridge's most recent letter, which had been specific and careful and had used the phrase imminent legal action in a way that meant Harold was done with the preliminary round. She heard Silas's door open down the hall, heard him cross to the window, heard the particular sound of a man assessing. Then she smelled it. It came under her door. Not the wet, clean smell of rain, but something older and drier and irreversible underneath. The smell of something burning. She was out of bed and in the hall before the thought was fully formed, and Silas was already at the front door, already pulling it open, and the light that came in from outside was wrong, orange and moving, with a kind of hot urgency that natural light doesn't have. The barn was on fire, not starting to burn. Burning. The south wall was already gone to flame and the roof's edge was catching, and even through the rain the fire was winning because whatever had started it had been given enough time to take hold before the rain arrived. "The horses," Evelyn said. "Stay here," Silas said, already moving. She did not stay. She followed him across the yard at a run, through the rain that hit like thrown gravel, and she was aware that this was not a reasonable thing to do, running toward a burning building in the middle of the night in a rainstorm. But the horses were in there, 4 of them, and she could hear them now, The particular high-edged sound of animals that understood exactly what was happening and were not able to get away from it. Silas hit the barn door with his shoulder and got it open, and the heat came out like a hand pushing back. And she went in beside him because she had decided, somewhere between the hall and the yard, that she was finished with letting things happen while she stood at a safe distance. The smoke was heavy on the left side where the fire had started, but the right side was still breathable, barely, and the horses were in the right side stalls because that was where they'd been put for the night. Silas went for the far stalls, and she went for the nearest, pulling the bolt on the first stall door and getting her shoulder into the opening because the horse inside, a gray mare named Belle, who Evelyn had been hand-feeding apple pieces to every morning for 6 weeks, was so frightened she was pressing herself into the wrong corner, away from the door. Belle. She kept her voice low and even, which was an extraordinary effort given that the roof above the south wall had just made a sound like something structural giving way. Belle, come on, girl, come on. She got the lead rope on her by feel in the smoke and pulled, and Belle came, not calmly, trembling so hard Evelyn could feel it through the rope, but she came. And they got out through the door and into the rain, and Evelyn handed her off to Cal, who had appeared from the bunkhouse with his boots on the wrong feet and his face white. She went back in. Silas had the other 3 out before she reached the second stall, appearing through the smoke with 2 ropes and Pete on his heels. The 4 of them moved the last horse out into the rain and stood there, all of them soaked and smoke-smelling and coughing, watching the barn's south wall collapse inward in a cascade of orange that the rain hissed against and did not extinguish. No one spoke for a moment. The rain kept falling. The horses moved in a tight group near the fence with the instinctive herd behavior of animals trying to reassure each other. Silas said. "Everyone out," Pete confirmed. Silas put his hands on his knees and breathed. He straightened up, looked at the barn. Then he looked at Evelyn. "You went back in," he said. "You were still in there," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the rain and the orange light, and something moved across his face that she couldn't read entirely but that had nothing to do with the fire. Then Cal said, "Mr. Boone," in a different kind of voice, and held up a lamp he'd retrieved from the fence post by the bunkhouse. He walked toward the barn's base, a few feet from where the fire had started, and crouched down and held the lamp low. The rain had dampened the earth around the barn's foundation. In the mud near the south wall, there was a clear, dark circle of scorched ground that was not where the fire had spread to. It was where the fire had started from. And at the edge of that circle, pressed into the mud by the weight of the rain, was a glass bottle. Not a lamp. Not anything that belonged on a ranch at night. Pete reached down and picked it up before anyone told him not to. Held it to Cal's lamp, turned it slowly. There was still a rag tucked into the neck of it, half burned. The 5 of them stood in the rain looking at it. Evelyn felt the cold of the rain and the heat still coming off the ruined wall, and both of them together felt like something arriving from outside her and going straight through. He had been here. Harold Vance, or someone he'd sent, had been here on her property in the dark, and had done this deliberately, and had not cared that there were animals inside that could not get themselves out. The anger she'd found in Silas's kitchen weeks ago, the one that had surprised her with its heat, came back now, and it was not the same size it had been before. It was larger. It had specificity and weight and a direction. "Silas," she said. He was already looking at her. "He was here," she said. He knew about the horses. He knew what the barn meant. She paused. He knew what would hurt. Silas took the bottle from Pete carefully, wrapped it in the cloth of his own shirt hem to protect it from the rain. "Yes," he said. "He was watching the ranch," she said. "Before tonight. He had to be." "Yes," Silas said again. His voice was controlled in the compressed way she had learned meant the most serious version of his anger. Around them, Red Willow was still sleeping. The storm was beginning to ease, the lightning moving east, the rain thinning. The barn's south wall was black and broken, steaming in the wet, and 3 of the 4 horses had stopped trembling. Cal and Pete were looking at Silas, waiting. Tom, who had arrived sometime during all of it in his long underwear, and was the most practical man alive despite all evidence of his ability to talk, was already assessing the remaining structure with a lantern, making the kind of quiet professional calculations that would inform rebuilding. Silas turned to her. Not to Pete or Cal. To her. "You said he doesn't stop unless something stops him," he said. "Yes," she said. "Then tomorrow morning we go into town. We go to Beaumont with this bottle, and we go to Aldridge with everything we have, and we stop being reactive." He looked at the barn and then back at her. "You said you wanted to stop surviving quietly." The rain was a whisper now, instead of a roar. Behind her, Belle had stopped trembling and was pressing her nose against Evelyn's shoulder, the way she did every morning when there were apple pieces. Evelyn looked at the ruined wall, at the bottle in Silas's hand, at the dark around the ranch that had hidden someone with enough hatred to do this, and hadn't hidden them well enough because the rain had preserved the ground and the bottle was evidence, and Harold Vance, for all his careful management of paper and narrative, had left a physical record on this particular night. She straightened her spine. It was an old habit, but it felt new. "I'm done being quiet," she said. They went to town before the ash on the barn wall had finished cooling. Silas wrapped the bottle in oilcloth and put it in a saddlebag, and they rode in the early morning gray before most of Red Willow had its coffee on, the road still soft from the rain, the horses quiet and tired from the night. Evelyn rode beside him without speaking for the first mile. She had changed into dry clothes and put her hair up and eaten half a biscuit that sat in her stomach like something she'd swallowed on principle rather than hunger, and she was making a list in her mind. Not of fears, which was what her mind would have made automatically 6 months ago, but of facts. What they had. What it proved. What it didn't prove yet and needed to. The bottle. The scorch pattern. The rag. The timing of the fire relative to the storm, which suggested whoever said it had anticipated the rain would limit response time. The letters from Harold, dated and kept. Aldridge had copies. She had originals. The first letter addressed to her. The debt ledger she couldn't prove, but whose existence she could testify to. And Dr. Harlan, wherever he was, who had looked at her over Harold's shoulder with eyes that said everything his professional caution had prevented him from saying aloud. She was building something. She could feel the shape of it. Beaumont was in his office when they arrived, which surprised her. She had expected to have to wait. He looked at the oilcloth bundle Silas set on his desk, and then at Silas's face, and he said, "What happened?" without a question mark, the way a man speaks when he can already see the answer in the other person's expression. Silas told him. Evelyn added the parts he left out, the timing, the specific placement of the scorch mark away from any lamp or lantern source, the significance of the bottle's position in the mud. She spoke clearly and without decoration, and she watched Beaumont's face change as she talked, the careful neutrality he'd worn in their first meeting, shifting into something that had edges to it. He picked up the bundle and unwrapped it carefully and looked at the bottle for a long time. "Whoever set this didn't come from town," he said finally. "Not at that hour, in that storm. They were already nearby." "He's been watching the ranch," Silas said. "Or someone he hired has." "You're saying Vance or an agent of his." "I'm saying the timing and the method are consistent with someone who knew the layout of the property and the location of the barn and had reason to want to damage what matters to us," Evelyn said. She was careful with the word us. She felt Silas note it. Beaumont set the bottle down. He looked at her differently than he had the first time. Not dramatically, but with the particular realignment of a man updating his assessment. "Mrs. Boone, I want to be direct with you. What I had before was letters that were unpleasant and a man making claims I couldn't verify. What I have now is evidence of arson on your property. Those are different situations." "Yes," she said, "they are. I'm going to need written statements from everyone on the property last night. I'll want to ride out and look at the site myself this afternoon." He paused. "I'm also going to send a telegraph to the county seat where Vance lives. Find out if there's any record of him or anyone traveling on his behalf being in this region in the past week." "Deputy Crane," Silas said with a particular flatness. Beaumont looked at him. "What about him?" "He met with a man last month who was asking questions about the ranch on someone's behalf. Tom Briggs's cousin saw it." A silence. Beaumont did not look away, and he did not look guilty, but something moved behind his eyes that was the particular expression of a man recalibrating something he had assumed was settled. "I'll speak with Crane," he said. "I'd appreciate it if you'd let us know what he says," Silas said. They went from the sheriff's office to Aldridge's, arriving before his working hours on a Saturday, which meant knocking on the door of the rooms above his office where he lived. He came down in shirt sleeves with the expression of a man who had been awake for some time already, which meant either he was an early riser or he'd received a communication that had gotten there ahead of them. It turned out to be the second thing. Vance's lawyer filed a petition yesterday, Aldridge said before they'd fully sat down. He set a document on his desk and pushed it across. Mental incompetency claim. Against you, Mrs. Boone, specifically. They're arguing you were not of sound mind when you entered into the marital contract and that the arrangement is therefore invalid. She read the document. Silas read it beside her. She was aware of her own breathing, slow and deliberate, the breathing of someone who has decided not to let a document make them smaller. He's trying to erase the marriage, she said. If the marriage is invalid, I'm legally… what? Back in his custody? He would argue you were never legally out of it, Aldridge said. The petition frames you as a ward who left without proper discharge of guardianship and who entered into a contract you lacked the legal capacity to make. She was 26 years old, Silas said. She answered an advertisement. She corresponded over the course of weeks. She traveled independently. She presented herself to a justice of the peace and answered questions and signed documents. I know, Aldridge said, which is why this petition is aggressive rather than strong. He's hoping to create enough legal confusion that the process itself becomes punishing. He looked at Evelyn. What it means practically is that there will be a hearing. A judge will assess the claim. You will have the opportunity to respond in person on the record. When? She asked. 6 weeks. The circuit judge comes through Red Willow in September. 6 weeks. She looked at the document again. Mental incompetency. The word he'd been holding over her head for months, and now he'd committed it to paper in a legal proceeding. He'd made the same mistake he always made when he pushed too far. He had put something in writing. The arson, she said. If Beaumont can connect the fire to Harold, it becomes a serious problem for his petition, Aldridge said, sitting forward. A man who claims his former ward is disturbed and needs his protection, while simultaneously arranging to burn her home. That contradiction is significant, very significant. He picked up his pen. Tell me everything about last night. They were there for 2 hours. By the time they left, Aldridge had 4 pages of notes and an expression she had not seen on him before, something close to eager, in the restrained way of a professional man who sees a case beginning to have the right shape. Walking to the wagon, Evelyn stopped. There was a man across the street, outside the feed store, who was not doing anything notable, standing, looking at nothing in particular, wearing a dark coat that was too warm for the weather. He was maybe 40, with the solid, unremarkable appearance of someone hired for presence rather than personality. She looked at him for exactly long enough to let him know she'd seen him. Then she turned to Silas. Don't look, she said quietly. Feed store, across the street. Heavy coat. Silas didn't look. How long has he been there? He was there when we came out of Beaumont's, she said, and he was sitting on that bench when we went into Aldridge's. Different position, but same block. A pause. Harold's man, Silas said, almost certainly. They got in the wagon. As they pulled out, she looked straight ahead and not at the man in the dark coat, because she had learned from Harold himself that the worst thing you could do was let someone know their surveillance was making you afraid. Afraid was information. She was finished giving Harold Vance free information. The ride home was different from other rides home. There was something that had crystallized overnight, in the fire, in the rain, in the moment, with the bottle in Pete's hand. And she could feel it in the way she was sitting, in the way the road looked to her. Less like something she was on temporarily and more like something that belonged to her. He filed it to throw us off, she said halfway home. The petition. He filed it because the letters weren't working and the man asking questions in town wasn't getting him what he needed. He wanted us reacting to the legal proceeding instead of building toward one of our own. And then he burned the barn, Silas said. When that didn't work fast enough either. He's losing patience. She watched the hills. That's new. He's always been patient, methodical. If he's losing patience, it means something is different this time. She paused, trying to find the thing underneath the thought. I think it's because I haven't come back. Every time I made any small attempt to get away, or to resist, or to… The thing he always had was that I eventually came back, or I stayed. I'd get as far as the thought of leaving and then find a reason not to. She paused. He expected me to fold. When I didn't fold, he tried to force it. When forcing it didn't work quickly enough, he… broke something, Silas said. Yes. She looked at her hands in her lap. But he doesn't know what breaking the barn did. He thinks it's made us afraid, made us retreating. He doesn't know we were at Beaumont's before sunrise with the bottle in oilcloth. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, that's an advantage. Yes, she said, and I want to keep it. The 6 weeks before the hearing were the most complicated of Evelyn's life, which was a high bar given the competition. They were complicated in the way that preparing for a fight is complicated. Not purely terrible, but exhausting in a way that required a different kind of attention than surviving required. Surviving was passive. This was active. Every day had a task, a communication, a decision. Aldridge found Dr. Harlan. He was 71 and had retired from active practice 2 years prior, but maintained his licensure and his records, which he kept with a physician's thoroughness in ledgers that went back 30 years. He remembered Evelyn. He said so in a letter to Aldridge that arrived 3 weeks before the hearing, and that Aldridge described, in the cover note he sent with it, as the most carefully worded document I have received from a non-lawyer in my professional career. Aldridge read her the relevant passage when she came to his office. The old doctor had written that he had treated a young woman named Evelyn Mercer on 2 occasions at the request of her guardian, Harold Vance. He had recorded the injuries as accidental in his formal notes because he had had insufficient evidence to do otherwise, and because Mr. Vance had been present at both appointments and had provided explanations that were, the doctor's word, plausible. He had written, however, in a private notation he had kept separately, that his clinical assessment of the patient's presentation was inconsistent with the explanations provided, and that he had developed significant concerns which he had lacked, at the time, the documentation, or the witness to act upon. He had carried those concerns for 11 years. He was, in his letter, very clear that he was prepared to testify to his private notation, his clinical observations, and his professional opinion that the injuries were inconsistent with the stated causes. He was also clear, and this was the part that sat with Evelyn for a long time after Aldridge finished reading, that he was sorry. Not in those exact words, because he was a careful man, but the letter ended with a sentence that said he hoped he had an opportunity to be of some use now, where he had not been of sufficient use before. She did not cry in Aldridge's office. She held it through the meeting and through the walk to the wagon and through most of the ride home, and then she cried for approximately 10 minutes on the seat of the wagon with Silas driving and saying nothing, and then she was done, and she wiped her face and they drove the rest of the way home, in the particular quiet of 2 people who don't need to explain themselves to each other. "He's going to come to the hearing," she said when the ranch appeared over the rise. "Harlan?" "Harold." She looked at the repaired barn. Tom and Pete and Cal had worked on it for 2 weeks and gotten the structure sound again, though it still smelled of char and the new wood sat pale against the old. He won't let a lawyer represent him at a distance for this. This is personal. He'll come. Silas pulled the wagon up and sat for a moment with the reins in his hands. "You're sure?" "He'll want to see it," she said. "He'll want to be in the room. That's how he is. He needs to be present for the control of it." She looked at the barn. "And he'll want me to see him. He'll think that if he can get me in a room and I can see him, I'll—" She stopped. "He'll think that's still a tool he has." "Is it?" Silas asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. She thought about that honestly, the way she'd been trying to do things, honestly, without the automatic minimizing she'd spent years performing. "I don't know," she said. "I've never faced him with an exit. I've never faced him when the room wasn't his." "This room won't be his," Silas said. "No," she said. "It won't." She started her testimony preparation with Aldridge 5 days before the hearing. He sat across from her in his office with a clean sheet of paper and told her he was going to ask her questions, and she was going to answer them the same way she'd answer in front of a judge. Complete, factual, direct, no editorializing, no emotion where emotion was not necessary. She understood the instruction and she mostly followed it, except for the 3rd session when Aldridge asked her to describe the specific incidents of physical harm, and she got through 2 of them before her voice went somewhere she couldn't reach it from, and she had to stop and drink water and look at the ceiling for a moment. "Take your time," Aldridge said. "I know," she said. "I know." She put the water glass down. "He's going to have a lawyer who asks these same questions and makes them sound like I'm the one who—" "Yes," Aldridge said. "And here's what I want you to remember when that happens. His lawyer's job is to make the jury doubt you. Your job is not to convince every person in that room. Your job is to tell the truth clearly enough that the truth can survive being doubted. He paused. Can you do that? She thought about the herb garden, the mint that had come back, patient and without drama, through hard soil and neglect. Yes, she said. Beaumont's telegraph to Harold's home county had come back with something useful. A record of a man named Doyle, employed periodically by Harold Vance for purposes listed as property management, who had been absent from the county during the week of the fire. Absent without explanation, which was not evidence of arson, but was, as Beaumont put it, a significant thread. He had requested a deputy from the county seat to bring Doyle in for questioning. It was not yet the stopped pipe, but it was the hand on the valve. The night before the hearing, Evelyn could not sleep. She lay in her room with the key under her hand, the old habit still there, and she thought about being 15 years old and newly parentless and grateful for any outstretched hand. She thought about how long she had spent making herself smaller so there was less of her to damage. She thought about the first morning at the ranch when she'd made coffee at an unfamiliar stove and heard Silas come in and braced herself automatically for the quality of his mood, and how it had taken her 3 weeks to stop doing that. She got up at 4 and went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat with it in the dark, until she heard Silas's door and his footsteps, and he came in and poured a cup and sat across from her, and they sat in the dark kitchen in the quiet that had become its own language between them. "You're going to do fine," he said after a while. "You don't know that," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I know you." She looked at him across the table. In the low lamplight, he looked tired and solid and real in the way that mattered. Not dramatically reassuring, not performing confidence, just there, the same way he was always there, steadily and without requiring anything in return. "He'll try to talk to me," she said, "before the proceedings. He'll try to get me alone somehow. He'll have something ready, something designed to make me feel like I'm already losing before we've even started." "Then we make sure you're not alone," Silas said. "I need to be able to handle him, Silas. If he finds a moment, I need to be able to handle it without—" She stopped. "I need to not flinch." "You didn't flinch when you went back into the burning barn," Silas said. "You didn't flinch in Beaumont's office. You haven't flinched once in this entire thing." He looked at her steadily. "The flinching was something he put in you. You've been taking it out since the day you got on that train. There's not much left of it." She wrapped both hands around her cup. The coffee was strong and real and warm against her palms. "I'm going to tell it all," she said. "In that room. I'm not going to minimize or manage I'm going to say it completely. All of it." "I know," he said. "It's going to be uncomfortable. For the room." "Let it be," Silas said. The hearing was in the Red Willow County Hall, a building that served as courtroom, meeting hall, and on one notable occasion that Tom Briggs had described in detail, an emergency sheep shelter. The circuit judge's name was Alderman, and he had the look of a man who had presided over enough frontier hearings to be unsurprised by most of what human beings did to each other, which Evelyn decided to find reassuring. Harold Vance arrived with his lawyer, a tall, smooth man from the capital named Stearns, who wore his suit like a statement, and 2 men who stood near the door and said nothing, which was Harold's way of making sure a room understood that he traveled with weight. She saw Harold for the first time in 7 months. He looked the same. That was the first thing that registered, and it was somehow the most destabilizing fact in the room, that she had lived through everything since that last morning in his kitchen, had come through fear and distance and fire and preparation, and he had simply continued existing, looking exactly as he always had, gray-templed and well-dressed and calm, in the particular way of a man who expects rooms to arrange themselves around him. He looked at her. He did not smile. He did something more precise than smiling. He composed his expression into something that was almost concern, almost care, the expression he had always used in public when he wanted people to see a devoted guardian worried about an unstable ward. She looked back, directly, without dropping her eyes. Something shifted in his face, small, almost nothing, but she'd spent 11 years reading his face with the accuracy of someone whose safety depended on it, and she saw it. He hadn't expected her to look back. She found a seat beside Aldridge, and Silas sat to her other side, and she put her hands flat on the table in front of her and kept her breathing steady and did not look at Harold Vance again until she was required to. Stearns opened with language so careful and so precisely sympathetic that it would have been impressive if it hadn't been in service of a lie. He used words like fragile and vulnerable and unsuitable circumstances in reference to Evelyn, and he said the name Harold Vance with the particular reverence of a man describing a long-suffering benefactor. He produced the ledger, the debt ledger that Evelyn had never been permitted to see, and submitted it as evidence of Harold's ongoing financial and moral responsibility for her welfare. Aldridge objected to its admissibility as a self-created document without independent verification. Judge Alderman looked at it, looked at Stearns, and said, "I'll allow it as exhibit, but I'll weigh it accordingly." Then Aldridge called Dr. Harlan. The old man walked to the witness position slowly, with a cane, and took his time settling, and the room waited for him. He was 71 and had the physical presence of someone who had spent decades being trusted by people in their worst moments, and it showed. He was not dramatic. He was precise. He stated his name and his credentials and his 30 years of practice. He stated that he had treated the patient Evelyn Mercer on 2 occasions. He described in clinical terms the injuries he had observed and the explanations he had been given. He described in the same clinical terms why his professional assessment had differed from those explanations. He produced his private notation, dated 11 years ago, and read from it in a voice that did not waver. Stearns cross-examined him vigorously. Why had he not reported his concerns at the time? Was it not possible he was misremembering? Was it not possible his private notation was colored by his later knowledge of this hearing? The old doctor answered each question with the same unhurried precision. He had not reported at the time due to insufficient evidentiary foundation and the presence of the guardian at the appointments. He was not misremembering. His notation was dated and consistent with his records. His memory, he said pleasantly, had not degraded to the point that he required correction by a lawyer in a county seat he'd never been to before. There was a sound in the gallery. Not laughter exactly. Something like the release of a held breath. Then Aldridge called Evelyn. She walked to the witness position and sat down and looked at Judge Alderman, who looked back at her with the neutral patience of someone who was genuinely listening, and she took one breath. She told the truth. She told it without minimizing, without the careful soft pedaling she had spent years applying to her own story to make it easier for other people to receive. She told it in full, concrete, specific detail. The ledger she had never seen, the debts she had never agreed to, the isolation that had happened slowly enough that she hadn't named it as isolation until she was on the other side of it. She told it about the women who had drifted away and why. She told it about the 2 visits to Dr. Harlan and what Harold had said in the room on both occasions and what he had said on the ride home afterward. She told it about the wrist. She described it the way a person describes a fact, what happened, what sound it made, what she did in the 30 seconds after. She did not perform the emotion of it. The emotion was simply present in the room, without her manufacturing it, because it was true, and truth has weight. Stearns objected 3 times during Aldridge's examination. Alderman sustained one and overruled 2. Then Stearns cross-examined her. He was skilled at this. She had expected skilled. He came at the inconsistencies. Why had she waited so long? Why had she not gone to anyone? Why had she not, if it was as she described, found some means of recourse? His tone stayed sympathetic while his questions worked like instruments, probing for the place where her account would come apart. She answered every question. She answered it directly and without hostility and without apology. She told him that she had not gone to anyone because she had been systematically separated from anyone she might have gone to. And she told him this not as an accusation, but as a description of a mechanism, and she felt the room understanding the mechanism in real time, which was something she had not expected to feel. At one point, Stearns leaned forward slightly and said, "Mrs. Boone, isn't it true that you had opportunities to leave over the course of 11 years and chose, on every occasion, to remain?" She looked at him. "I stayed," she said, "because I was 15 years old when it started, and because I had nowhere to go, and because he made sure I understood that the debts in his ledger meant I legally couldn't leave, and because by the time I understood that the ledger was fiction, I had been isolated long enough that I was no longer certain I was capable of managing on my own, which was the precise outcome he had worked to produce." She paused. "Choosing to remain is not the correct description of what I did. Surviving inside a system designed to make leaving feel impossible is the correct description. Those are different things." The room was very quiet. Stearns moved on. He was still professional, still controlled, but she had felt something shift in the quality of the room's attention, and she thought he had felt it too. Harold Vance took the stand last. He was composed and fluent and absolutely certain of himself, which had always been his greatest asset, and which had always required an audience that didn't know what she knew. He spoke about his years of care and provision. He spoke with the practiced sorrow of a man describing a failure. Not his, but hers. The failure of a fragile young woman to manage herself appropriately, despite every effort on his part. He was very good. She watched the room while he spoke, and she could see some people wavering, the way people waver when someone confident tells them a coherent story. And then Aldridge asked Harold Vance in redirect to explain his relationship with a man named Doyle. The room shifted. Harold's composure held. "I employ several people for various tasks. I'm not certain which Doyle you mean." Aldridge produced a document, Beaumont's telegram record, Doyle's employment history, the dates of his absence from Harold's county, the dates of the fire. "I'd ask you to explain," Aldridge said, "why a man in your employ was absent from your county and unaccounted for during the precise week when my client's barn was deliberately set on fire." Stearns objected. Alderman looked at the document, looked at Harold. "I'll allow the question," he said. Harold Vance looked at the document. Something happened in his face. Not the small thing she'd seen when their eyes met across the room, but something larger, a seam opening in the composure. And for the first time in her memory, she saw Harold Vance look like a man who had run out of prepared answers. "I don't know what Doyle does with his time when he's not working for me," Harold said. His voice had changed slightly, tighter. "Did you direct or ask or encourage Doyle in any communication, written or verbal, to travel to Red Willow County?" Aldridge asked. "No." "Are you willing to state that under oath for the record?" "I already am under oath," Harold said sharply. "Then the record reflects your denial," Aldridge said, and turned back to his table. And the way he did it, simply, without drama, was the most effective thing Evelyn had seen in a courtroom. She sat with her hands flat on the table and watched Harold Vance collect himself from the witness position and return to his seat, and she noticed that his lawyer Stearns did not look at him when he sat down, which was a very specific kind of tell. Judge Alderman took a recess of 2 hours to review his notes and the evidence. Evelyn sat outside on a bench in the September sun with Silas beside her and did not speak for a long time. "You held," Silas said at one point. "I know," she said. She felt wrung out and clear-eyed and oddly calm, the way you feel after something breaks precisely the way it was supposed to. "The mint came back," she said, which was not a non sequitur to her, though it might have sounded like one. Silas looked at her. "In the garden," she said. "It's taken the whole bed back. I was going to thin it this week." He nodded slowly. "I'll help." When Alderman returned, he spoke for 20 minutes in the measured, structured way of a man who had organized his thinking carefully and was presenting it in the order it needed to be heard. He addressed the petition for mental incompetency first. He found no credible evidentiary basis for the claim and dismissed it with language that was polite and permanent. He addressed the debt ledger and declined to recognize it as a valid legal instrument in the absence of any corroborating documentation or witness. He addressed Evelyn's legal status and found it precisely what it appeared to be: a woman who had, as an adult, made a legal marriage which was valid and stood. He addressed the arson evidence last. He could not, on the basis of current evidence, make a criminal finding in this proceeding, but he stated clearly and on the record that the evidence of deliberate arson on the Boone property was credible and that his finding would be transmitted to the appropriate jurisdiction for investigation. He looked at Harold Vance when he said the word investigation, with the particular directness of a judge making sure something is understood. Harold Vance sat very still. Evelyn looked at him. She let herself look at him fully, without the old reflex of looking away, without the management and the caution. She looked at him the way you look at something that had power over you and no longer does, and she felt the specific sensation of that, not triumphant, not even relieved exactly, but real, solid, like setting down something heavy after so long you'd forgotten you were carrying it. He didn't look at her. For the first time in 11 years, Harold Vance was the one who looked away. Harold Vance left Red Willow. The same afternoon the hearing ended, and Evelyn knew because she saw it. Not deliberately, not because she'd been watching for it, but because she and Silas were loading the wagon outside the general store when his hired coach went past on the main street, moving at the pace of a man who had somewhere else to be and no longer had a reason to pretend otherwise. She watched it go. She did not feel what she had imagined she would feel, which was something large and conclusive, like a door slamming. What she felt was quieter than that, more like a window being opened in a room that had been closed too long. Not dramatic, just air moving through where air hadn't moved in a while. Silas came out of the store with a sack of flour and set it in the wagon bed and followed her gaze down the street to where the coach had turned the corner and disappeared. "Gone?" he said. "Gone," she said. He nodded once and picked up the next sack. She picked up the one beside it. They loaded the rest of the wagon together in the ordinary way, without ceremony, and drove home under a September sky that had gone the particular deep blue of the season turning, and the road had dried out completely from the summer storms, and the wagon rolled easy, and the horses were unhurried. It took 3 more weeks for the full legal resolution to arrive, because that is how legal resolutions work. Not like a verdict in a story, clean and immediate, but in layers, documents arriving out of sequence, things confirmed and then reconfirmed and then confirmed again by different offices. Aldridge handled most of it and reported to them in his careful way, each development stated plainly without inflation or drama. The debt petition was formally and permanently dismissed. The marriage was affirmed as legally valid. The transmission of the arson evidence to Harold's home county produced, 2 weeks after the hearing, a warrant for the arrest of the man named Doyle on suspicion of arson, and Doyle, who was apparently less committed to Harold Vance's interests than Harold had believed, provided a statement within 48 hours of his arrest that implicated Harold directly in the planning and funding of the fire. Aldridge sent that news in a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning and that Evelyn read standing at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. "Doyle talked," she said, when Silas came in from the morning check. He stopped, read her face. "Enough to matter?" "Enough to arrest him," she said. "Harold, they issued a warrant." Silas was quiet for a moment. He pulled out his chair and sat down slowly, the way a man sits when his body needs a moment that his face won't show. She set the letter on the table between them, and they both looked at it the way you look at something that represents a long time of something hard, finally shifting into a different state. "It won't be a fast process," she said. She had learned enough in the past months to know that. "His lawyer there'll be delays and motions, and it could take a year or more before anything—" "I know," Silas said. "But it's on record," she said. "Everything is on record. Whatever he does from here, he's doing it with a warrant and a statement and a judge's findings already attached to his name." She paused. "He's spent his whole life managing his record. He's very careful about what follows him in writing." She looked at the letter. "Now it follows him." Silas looked at her. "How do you feel?" She considered the question honestly, which she had been practicing, answering questions about her own interior honestly, without the reflexive flattening she'd done for so long. "Like something that was pulling at me stopped pulling," she said finally. "Not like it's gone, like it's not pulling anymore." He nodded. That was enough for him, which was one of the things she had come to understand about Silas. He did not need her feelings to be resolved or tidy. He just needed them to be real. "I want to thin the mint," she said. "Today. Will you help me?" He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression she had stopped trying to name and had simply started allowing to be there. "Yes," he said, after the east fence check. "After the east fence," she agreed. They worked the garden together that afternoon, the two of them on their knees in the turned earth with the September light coming in sideways and warm, and the mint had in fact taken over completely, sprawling thick and fragrant across the whole bed, muscling out everything that had tried to grow beside it. Which was, Evelyn thought, both the virtue and the problem of mint. It survived everything and then became the thing that needed managing. She pulled runners and replanted them in a new section she'd prepared at the far end of the bed, dividing what had been one overwhelming mass into something with room to be multiple things. Silas dug where she pointed and patted soil back with the comfortable efficiency of someone who had learned her system and trusted it, and they didn't talk much, and what they did say was the practical language of the work. Deeper there, that root goes under, leave that one it's anchoring the edge, and it was ordinary and sufficient and exactly right. Ruth, Pete's wife, came by the ranch that Thursday with a jar of preserved peaches and the information, delivered with the plain directness of a woman who believed in people knowing what was being said about them, that the conversation in Red Willow had changed. "Mrs. Calloway said something at the post office yesterday," Ruth said, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. "Said she'd had it wrong about you. Said she should have trusted her own instincts instead of the letters." She paused. "She's not a bad woman. She's just cautious about new people, and she got given information that worked on that." "I know," Evelyn said. "I don't blame her." Ruth looked at her. "You don't?" "He's very good at finding the thing that works on a person," Evelyn said. "Mrs. Calloway values caution, so he gave her something to be cautious about. Deputy Crane values procedure, so he gave him a procedural concern. He always found the right tool for the right lock." She set her own cup down. "I'm more interested in what happens from here than in sorting out who believed what." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You should know that what you did in that courtroom, people talked about it, the way you spoke. There are women in this county who've been sitting with things for a long time and watching you stand up in front of a judge and say it plainly." She stopped. It meant something. Evelyn looked at the table. She felt the weight of that land on her, and she didn't deflect it, which was new. The old version of her would have minimized it, turned it back into something manageable and small. She let it sit. "I didn't feel brave," she said. "I felt like I was finally doing the thing I should have done a long time ago." "That's what brave usually feels like," Ruth said. "It doesn't feel like courage from the inside, it just feels like finally." Evelyn thought about that for a long time after Ruth left. She thought about it while she was making supper, and while she was eating it, and while she was washing the dishes. And it settled in her alongside everything else that had settled in over these months. The understanding that she had not been weak, that she had been in something designed to produce the appearance of weakness, and that these were not the same thing, no matter how much they had looked the same from inside. The first woman came to the ranch in October. Her name was Clara, and she came with one bag and a bruise along her jaw that she'd tried to cover with powder. And she'd heard from Ruth, who'd heard from the postmistress, who'd heard from someone who'd been at the hearing, that Evelyn Boone was a person you could go to. She stood at the gate of the ranch looking like someone who wasn't sure the door was going to open and would not entirely have blamed it if it didn't, and Evelyn saw her from the kitchen window and went out. She didn't make a fuss of it. She opened the gate and said, "Come in out of the cold." And Clara came in, and Evelyn made coffee and found some bread and let the silence sit until Clara was ready to put something into it. It took about 20 minutes. "I don't know what I'm doing here," Clara said. "I don't have a plan." "You don't need one yet," Evelyn said. "You just needed to get out first. The plan comes after." Clara looked at her. "You really did it? You really just left?" "I got on a train at 4:30 in the morning with my clothes on in layers because I couldn't risk a bag," Evelyn said. "That was the plan. Get to the train. The rest I figured out after." Something shifted in Clara's face. The particular shift that happens when a person who has been told a thing is impossible sees evidence that it has been done. Silas, when he came in for supper and found Clara at the kitchen table, adapted with the specific, unpretentious flexibility of a man who had made peace with his household becoming something he hadn't originally planned. He said hello, he added a place at the table, he ate and spoke normally, and afterward he helped Clara carry her bag to the spare room at the end of the hall. Not the room that had been Evelyn's, which had become something else over these months, but a room they'd made up with a quilt and a lock on the door and a key on the hook. He handed her the key without making a production of it, and Evelyn watched him do it and felt something warm and certain move through her chest. Clara stayed for 3 weeks. She left with a plan and a name in the next county, a woman lawyer that Aldridge had mentioned once, who handled exactly these situations, who had built a small practice on the premise that the law belonged to women as much as anyone, and that its tools could be used in that direction if you had someone willing to use them. 2 more women came before winter, word traveling the way it travels in country communities, not through announcement, but through the careful, private passing of a name from one person to another, in low voices, in the back rooms of dry goods stores, and at the edges of church socials where husbands couldn't hear. Evelyn Boone, out at the Boone Ranch. Go to her. She'll know what to do. She didn't always know what to do. That was the truth of it. Some situations were beyond her direct help, and she said so honestly and directed people toward Aldridge or toward the woman lawyer or toward Ruth, who had turned out to have a gift for the practical logistics of helping someone relocate quietly without triggering the person they were relocating from. Some women came and left quickly. One stayed for 2 months. One Evelyn had to tell, gently, that she wasn't ready yet, that she was planning to go back, and she didn't try to stop her, because she remembered every time she had almost left and gone back, and she knew the shape of not being ready, and she knew the only thing that worked was the decision made from inside, not the one pushed from outside. That was one of the harder lessons. You could not save someone who had decided not to be saved yet. You could only make sure they knew the door was there. Silas watched all of this without complaint and without the kind of ostentatious support that would have made her feel managed. He fixed the spare room's window latch when it stuck. He extended the kitchen garden fence so there was more private outdoor space. He told Tom Briggs, with characteristic brevity, that if he discussed the ranch's guests in town, Silas would find a different man for the morning feed, and Tom, to his credit, understood the assignment and kept quiet about it from that point forward. He did not take credit for any of it. He did not refer to the ranch as a refuge or a sanctuary or any word that would have made it into a project rather than a household. He just kept the place running and made room for what it was becoming, and sometimes in the evenings, when it was just the two of them at the kitchen table with the winter dark outside the windows and the stove going good, she would look across at him and feel the specific sensation of something that had started as a practical arrangement and had become, over the course of a year and a fire and a courtroom and a herb garden reclaimed from neglect, something she didn't have an adequate word for. She told him that once, in the inexact way that things get said when you've stopped managing your words so carefully. "I don't have a word for what this is," she said. She meant the two of them. She meant the ranch and the marriage and the way the evenings felt. He considered that for a moment. "Does it need one?" "Maybe not," she said. "We built something," he said. "It doesn't have to fit in a category to be real." She looked at him across the table, the lamp between them, the winter sound of the wind working at the eaves, the same eaves she had listened to on her first night here, when she'd been lying on the floor against the locked door with the key in both hands, not sure if anything could be trusted. "I was afraid of you at the beginning," she said. "Not afraid you'd hurt me. Afraid of how ordinary you were, how normal everything was. I kept waiting for the other thing to show up." "I know," he said. "You knew?" "I watched you flinch every time I came in a door for the first month," he said. "Not at me specifically, at the door opening, at not knowing what was coming through it." She hadn't realized he'd seen that. She was quiet for a moment. "You never said anything," she said. "What would I have said?" He looked at her steadily. "You were working it out. You needed to work it out. It wasn't mine to rush." That was the thing about him that she had not known how to value at first because she had never encountered it. He understood the difference between his role and her process. He had never tried to fix her or rescue her or take credit for her recovery. He had provided conditions. What grew in them was hers. She thought about the mint again, the way it had come back through hard soil on its own timeline, indifferent to whether anyone was watching or waiting or hoping. It had simply done the work of being alive, and eventually there was more of it than the bed could hold, and the task had become not coaxing it back but making room for all it had become. She thought she was something like that. She thought she had always been something like that, under everything he had put on top of it. The conviction came in the following March. Aldridge sent the letter, and it arrived on a Wednesday, and she read it twice standing at the kitchen table in the early morning, the same way she'd read Doyle's statement months before. Harold Vance had been convicted on 2 counts relating to the arson and 1 count of fraud relating to the debt ledger, which had been examined by a financial authority who found it altered, inconsistent, and partially fabricated. The sentences were concurrent. He would not be managing anyone's life from where he was going. She set the letter down. She stood with her hands on the table and she let the fact of it arrive fully, without rushing it or containing it or translating it immediately into what it meant for the future. She let it be what it was, the end of something that had started when she was 15 years old and parentless and desperate for a hand, any hand, even a hard one. She had spent 11 years inside what Harold Vance made. She had spent a year and a half making her way out of it. She was not, at 28 years old, entirely out. Some of it was still in her, probably would be for a long time. in the flinches that still came occasionally, and the hyper-awareness of doors opening and the moments when she caught herself minimizing something true, because minimizing was so old it sometimes ran ahead of her intention. But she was out enough. She was far enough out that the rest was hers to work on, at her own pace, in her own time, in a house with a garden that was completely out of control in the best possible way, and a man who knew the difference between support and management and had never once confused the two. Silas was at the barn when she went to find him. The new barn, built mostly sound now, still smelling of new lumber in the corners, the pale wood panels gradually weathering to match the old. She came around the door and he was working on a piece of tack, hands busy, and he looked up when she came in. She didn't say anything at first. She just held up the letter. He put the tack down and read it, and she watched his face, and she saw the thing that moved through him. Not triumph, something quieter than that, something with relief in it, and something else that she thought was just the feeling of being glad something hard was finished. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. He handed the letter back. She folded it and put it in her apron pocket. "We should fix the north fence line today," she said. "Cal's been putting it off." "I know," he said. "I'll get him on it." She started to turn and then stopped. She turned back. He was watching her with that same direct, unhurried look she had learned to simply receive without deflecting it. "I want to say something," she said, "and I want to say it plainly, I want to say it without managing it first." He waited. "You didn't save me," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I saved myself. I got on the train. I signed the papers. I went into the burning barn. I stood up in that courtroom and said it all out loud. That was me." "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "It was." "But you made it possible to do all of that," she said. "Not by doing it for me. By not making it harder. By being someone I didn't have to manage or protect or perform for." She paused. "That sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You made it possible for me too," he said. "This ranch was just a place I was maintaining. You made it a home again." A pause. "That's not a small thing either." She looked at him. He looked at her. The barn smelled of new wood and old hay and horses. And outside March. The March light was different from September's, thinner and more tentative, still finding its footing in the season, came through the open door in a long, pale stripe across the floor. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She went to find Cal about the fence. He went back to the tack. And outside the garden was still there, untidy and persistent and full of mint that needed managing again. And the new grass along the fence line was coming in green from the winter wet. And the road into Red Willow was dry and ordinary, and hers to use whenever she chose, without asking permission, without accounting for her time, without anyone waiting to know where she'd been. She was not a symbol. She did not think of herself that way and wouldn't have recognized herself in that language. She was a woman who had gotten out of something hard and landed somewhere real and built, imperfectly and with significant difficulty, and more than one failure of nerve along the way, a life that belonged to her. The women who came to the ranch gate in the months and years that followed, Clara had been the first but not the last, not by a long stretch, did not come because Evelyn had all the answers. She didn't. She told them that plainly. She told them she'd been afraid longer than she hadn't been, that she'd gone back to the edge of leaving a dozen times before the time she actually went, that she still sometimes caught herself checking a room when she entered it, cataloging exits and moods. The old survival reflex that didn't fully die just because the danger that made it necessary was gone. She told them that too, because she thought the truth of it mattered more than a clean story. Clean stories made people feel like they were failing when their own process was slow or non-linear or backtracking. The real story was that leaving was not one moment. It was 100 small decisions, and some of them were wrong, and you made them anyway, and eventually the wrong ones fell away and the right ones accumulated until you were somewhere different than where you'd started. That was what she had. That was what she gave them. Not rescue, but evidence. Evidence that the other side existed, and that you could get to it without being exceptional, without being especially brave or especially smart or especially anything. You just had to keep making the next small decision until the decisions added up to somewhere new. Ruth helped. Aldridge helped. The woman lawyer in the next county became something like an unofficial partner in the whole improbable thing that the Boone Ranch had become. Still a working cattle ranch, still loud with Tom Briggs and Sunburned Cal and Pete's steady presence, still smelling of hay and horse and the particular dusty warmth of productive land, but also something else layered underneath all of that, something with a name that nobody had formally given it because nobody needed to. Some evenings, when the work was done and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds, Evelyn sat in the kitchen with her coffee and the slow satisfaction of a day that had asked real things of her and received real things back. And she thought about the woman who had gotten on a train with her clothes on in layers, and her mother's photograph pressed against her ribs, and her hands shaking so badly she'd held a peppermint candy in her fist for 2 hours just to have something to grip. She felt affection for that woman. That surprised her still, a little. That she could look back at the most frightened version of herself and feel tenderness rather than shame. But she had come to understand that the frightened version had done something extraordinary, which was refuse to stop. Under all the compliance and the management and the careful smallness, something in her had kept saying not yet, not this, not forever, quietly, stubbornly, in the way of things that don't require permission to persist. The mint had been doing that the whole time, under the dead growth and the neglect and the seasons of nothing much being tended. Just waiting. Not for rescue. For room. She finished her coffee. She rinsed the cup and set it on the shelf and turned off the lamp and went to bed in the room that had been hers since the first night she arrived. The room with the window that looked out at the hills. The room with the lock that worked from the inside. The room where she had sat on the floor with a key between her palms and not known yet that anything could be different than what it had always been. She knew now. The key was still on the hook. She left it there. Not because she needed it anymore, but because she had decided that some things you keep not out of fear, but out of respect for the person you had to be to survive long enough to become who you were now. The hills outside the window were dark and still. The ranch breathed around her, familiar and specific. The creak of the new barn settling into itself, the low sound of cattle somewhere past the fence line, the wind through the eaves with the sound of something that had found where it was going. She closed her eyes. She slept.